Evelyn had always lived life in the fast lane. Born into a family with more money than they knew what to do with, she grew up surrounded by luxury and privilege. Private jets, five-star hotels, and designer clothes were just part of her everyday reality. But despite all the glitz and glamour, Evelyn often felt like something was missing. She craved excitement, something that would make her stand out even more. Social media became her playground, where she posted outrageous stunts and over-the-top adventures to keep her followers hooked. Every vacation had to be bigger, bolder, and crazier than the last. This time, she chose London as her destination. The city was buzzing with history, culture, and iconic landmarks, making it the perfect backdrop for her next big move. Armed with her camera crew, a small team she hired to capture every moment, Evelyn landed at Heathrow Airport ready to conquer the British capital. Her itinerary was packed. Afternoon tea at the Ritz, shopping on Oxford Street, and a private tour of Buckingham Palace. It wasn't long before she found herself standing outside the palace gates, marveling at its grandeur. As she wandered through the grounds, one thing caught her attention: the royal guards. Dressed in their striking red tunics and towering bearskin hats, they stood motionless like statues, completely unfazed by the crowd around them. Tourists snapped photos, children giggled, and some even tried silly antics to get a reaction from the stoic soldiers. But no matter what happened, the guards remained perfectly still, embodying discipline and tradition. Evelyn watched this scene unfold with growing fascination. Her mind began racing with ideas. What if she could break their composure? What if she did something so unexpected that it would leave everyone talking? The thought excited her. After all, she thrived on attention, and this seemed like the ultimate challenge. A mischievous grin spread across her face as she whispered to her assistant, "I think I've got an idea." Without wasting another second, she dashed off to a nearby art supply store, returning with cans of bright paint hidden inside her designer handbag. Standing there among the tourists, Evelyn felt a mix of nerves and adrenaline. She told herself it was just a harmless prank, a way to entertain her millions of followers online. No one would get hurt, right? The guards were trained professionals. Surely, they'd understand it was all in good fun, or so she convinced herself. As she approached the line of guards, her heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment when she'd create yet another viral sensation. Little did she know, this decision would change her life forever. Evelyn's excitement grew as she clutched the cans of paint in her bag, her mind racing with thoughts of how this prank would play out. She imagined the shock on people's faces, the gasps from the crowd, and the endless likes and comments flooding her social media accounts. It all seemed so thrilling, like a scene straight out of one of her favorite movies. But deep down, there was a tiny voice of doubt nagging at her. Was this really okay? Would anyone stop her before things went too far? Ignoring that inner warning, Evelyn decided to test the waters first. She lingered near the guards, watching other tourists try their best to get a reaction. Some waved wildly in front of their faces, while others made funny noises or struck ridiculous poses. None of it worked. The guards remained statuesque, unbothered by the chaos around them. Their unwavering focus fascinated Evelyn, but also fueled her determination. If these attempts didn't work, then surely hers would stand out. She wandered over to a quieter part of the palace grounds, where fewer people were gathered. There she spotted Corporal James Harper, standing tall and proud in his crimson uniform. His polished boots gleamed under the sunlight, and his expression was calm yet commanding. Something about him intrigued Evelyn. Maybe it was the way he carried himself with such dignity, or perhaps it was the weight of tradition he represented. Whatever it was, she felt drawn to him, not because she respected it, but because she wanted to disrupt it. Her pulse quickened as she pulled out a can of neon green paint. "This is going to be epic," she muttered under her breath, glancing around to see if anyone was paying attention. A few tourists were busy snapping photos, and a couple of kids chased pigeons nearby. No one seemed to notice her sneaky movements. Confidence surged through her veins. She took a step closer to Corporal Harper, rehearsing what she'd say afterward for her video. Totally worth it. Or did you see their face? Priceless. The captions were already forming in her head. But just as she was about to act, a woman standing nearby gave her a curious look. "Excuse me, miss," the woman said politely. "What's in your bag?" Evelyn froze for a split second, then forced a laugh. "Oh, nothing important," she replied, flashing a carefree smile. The woman shrugged and walked away, leaving Evelyn feeling both relieved and more emboldened. If no one stopped her now, why should she hesitate? A security guard stationed nearby glanced in her direction, but didn't approach. Evelyn interpreted this as a sign to go ahead. After all, wasn't curiosity part of human nature? People loved shocking moments. They'd click, share, and talk about it for days. And isn't that what being famous was all about? Her phone buzzed in her pocket with notifications from her latest Instagram post, teasing her big surprise. The pressure to deliver something unforgettable pushed her forward. With one last glance around, Evelyn stepped closer to Corporal Harper. Her heart raced as she unscrewed the lid of the paint can, the sharp smell filling the air. This was it, the moment she'd been building up to. She told herself it was just a joke, a harmless bit of fun. Surely, everyone would laugh along once they saw the footage. But as she raised the can, ready to pour, a flicker of unease crossed her mind. What if this wasn't as funny as she thought? What if she crossed a line she couldn't come back from? It was too late to turn back now. The moment Evelyn tipped the can of neon green paint over Corporal Harper's shoulder, time seemed to freeze. Bright, gooey streaks cascaded down his immaculate red tunic, splattering onto the ground beneath him. Casts erupted from the crowd as people turned in shock, their cameras instantly snapping photos and recording videos. Some tourists stepped back, horrified, while others craned their necks to get a better view of the chaos unfolding before them. For a brief second, Evelyn felt a rush of exhilaration. She had done it. This was her big, outrageous moment. But reality hit her like a tidal wave almost immediately. As the paint dripped down Corporal Harper's uniform, staining the fabric and pooling at his polished boots, Evelyn noticed something that sent chills down her spine. He didn't move, not even a twitch. His posture remained perfectly upright, his gaze fixed ahead as though nothing had happened. It wasn't defiance or anger, it was discipline. The kind of unshakable resolve that came from years of training and dedication to duty. In that moment, Evelyn realized she hadn't just pranked some random person. She had attacked a symbol of tradition, honor, and national pride. Her laughter faltered as the gravity of what she'd done began to sink in. She glanced around nervously, expecting someone, anyone, to laugh along with her or acknowledge the absurdity of the situation. Instead, she was met with cold stares. Parents ushered their children away, shaking their heads in disapproval. A group of elderly tourists muttered angrily under their breath, calling her behavior disrespectful and unforgivable. Even her own camera crew hesitated, lowering their equipment slightly as they exchanged uneasy glances. Before Evelyn could process what was happening, loud whistles pierced the air. Security officers stationed nearby sprinted toward her, their expressions stern and authoritative. One of them shouted, "Ma'am, step away immediately." Another grabbed her arm firmly but not roughly, leading her aside as murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. "What were you thinking?" one officer demanded, his tone sharp yet controlled. Evelyn stammered, trying to explain herself, but her words came out jumbled and weak. I thought it would be funny." She trailed off, realizing how hollow her excuses sounded. Meanwhile, Corporal Harper stood exactly where he had been, now covered in bright green paint that contrasted sharply with his crimson uniform. Though his face betrayed no emotion, those who looked closely could see the faintest tightening of his jaw, a subtle sign of the humiliation he must have been feeling. Other guards nearby maintained their composure, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. The once peaceful atmosphere of Buckingham Palace grounds had been shattered, replaced by confusion and outrage. As Evelyn was escorted away, she caught glimpses of people filming her, not with admiration or amusement, but with disdain. Phones were held high, capturing every detail of her public shaming. Someone shouted, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Another yelled, "This isn't entertainment." Each word cut deeper than the last, leaving her cheeks burning with shame. Her earlier confidence evaporated completely, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. What had she done? By the time she reached the security checkpoint, tears welled up in her eyes. She tried to reason with the officers, insisting that it was all a harmless prank meant to entertain, not offend. But they weren't swayed. "That's for the authorities to decide," one of them said curtly as they handed her over to the police waiting on the other side. As Evelyn climbed into the backseat of a squad car, she stared out the window at the palace gates growing smaller in the distance. For the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless and utterly alone. The police station was nothing like the luxurious settings Evelyn was used to. The sterile fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on cracked linoleum floors. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and paperwork, a far cry from the perfumed suites of five-star hotels she frequented. Sitting on a stiff wooden bench in the waiting area, Evelyn wrapped her arms tightly around herself, trying to hold back tears. For the first time in her life, she felt small, completely out of her element. Her phone had been confiscated almost immediately upon arrival, cutting off her connection to the outside world. No Instagram updates, no carefully crafted captions, no filters to soften the reality of her situation. She couldn't even imagine what people were saying about her now. Was her prank trending online? Were memes being made at her expense? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through her body. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together how quickly things had spiraled out of control. When she was finally led into an interrogation room, two officers sat across from her, their expressions unreadable but clearly unimpressed. One of them slid a file across the table and began explaining the charges against her: vandalism, public disorder, and contempt of court, due to the symbolic nature of the Royal Guard's role. Each word hit her like a punch to the gut. "Do you understand the seriousness of your actions?" one officer asked, his voice firm but calm. Evelyn nodded weakly, though she wasn't sure she fully grasped the magnitude yet. All she could think about was how much trouble she was in, and whether she'd ever be able to fix this. As the hours dragged on, news outlets picked up the story with alarming speed. Headlines blared across every major platform. Tourist defaces Royal Guard in shocking prank. Wealthy visitor sparks outrage at Buckingham Palace, and disrespectful stunt or criminal act. Social media exploded with reactions, most of them scathing. Hashtags like #RespectTheGuard and #ShameOnHer trended worldwide, with thousands of users condemning her behavior. Some called for severe punishment, while others mocked her wealth and privilege, suggesting this was just another example of a spoiled rich person thinking they were above the rules. Back home, Evelyn's family scrambled to respond. Her parents, who had always indulged her antics, were mortified. They hired top lawyers to represent her, but even they warned that public opinion might be impossible to sway. Friends who once cheered her on now distanced themselves, deleting old photos and posts featuring her. Brands she collaborated with began issuing statements disassociating themselves from her actions. Within hours, Evelyn went from being a social media sensation to a pariah. Meanwhile, Corporal Harper's plight became a focal point of sympathy. News articles highlighted his years of service, his dedication to duty, and the humiliation he endured because of Evelyn's reckless act. People rallied around him, praising his composure under such extraordinary circumstances. Online fundraisers were set up to support the Guard and his colleagues, with donations pouring in from all over the world. It was clear that Evelyn's actions hadn't just affected her. They had touched countless lives, many of whom viewed the Royal Guards as national treasures worthy of respect. By the time Evelyn was allowed to make a single phone call, her hands trembled as she dialed her mother's number. When her mom answered, her voice was heavy with disappointment. "Evelyn, what have you done?" she whispered, barely holding back tears. Those words cut deeper than anything else. Evelyn realized then that she wasn't just facing legal consequences. She had let down the people who mattered most to her. As she hung up the phone, slumping back in her chair, she knew there would be no quick fix for this mess. Whatever happened next, she would have to face it alone, and hope she could find a way to make amends. The courtroom was quiet, save for the faint shuffling of papers and the rhythmic tapping of a judge's pen against the wooden bench. Evelyn sat stiffly in her chair, her designer clothes replaced by a simple blouse and skirt, her attempt to appear more humble and serious. Her lawyers had coached her on how to behave. No dramatic gestures, no tears unless absolutely necessary, and above all, show remorse. But despite their advice, Evelyn couldn't shake the knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She glanced around the room, noticing reporters scribbling notes and cameras clicking softly from behind barriers. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a public spectacle. When the judge finally addressed her, his voice was stern but measured. "Ms. Evelyn Carter," he began, emphasizing her full name as if to remind her of the weight of her identity. "Your actions have not only disrespected an individual, but also tarnished a centuries-old tradition that holds great significance to this nation." Evelyn swallowed hard, nodding quickly to show she understood. The charges were laid out clearly: vandalism, disorderly conduct, and contempt of court due to the symbolic nature of the Royal Guard's role. Each accusation felt like another brick added to the wall closing in around her. Her lawyer stood up to speak next, presenting arguments aimed at mitigating her sentence. He highlighted her lack of prior offenses, her willingness to take responsibility, and her offer to cover all costs related to cleaning and restoring Corporal Harper's uniform. Evelyn had even agreed to pay for additional security measures at Buckingham Palace to prevent similar incidents in the future. But perhaps most importantly, her legal team emphasized her promise to donate the substantial sum, hundreds of thousands of dollars, to charities supporting military families and veterans. It was a desperate attempt to demonstrate that she wasn't just sorry, but committed to making things right. Despite these efforts, the prosecution remained unforgiving. They argued that Evelyn's wealth and privilege should not shield her from accountability. "This is not about money," the prosecutor said firmly, pacing in front of the bench. "It's about respect, for institutions, for traditions, and for the men and women who dedicate their lives to protecting them." The crowd murmured in agreement, many nodding along as they listened intently. Evelyn lowered her head, unable to meet anyone's gaze. For the first time, she truly understood that her actions weren't just a harmless prank. They had real consequences, ones that couldn't be erased with a checkbook or a heartfelt apology. After what felt like an eternity, the judge delivered his verdict. Evelyn would avoid jail time but was fined heavily, a sum so large that it wiped out nearly all of her personal savings. Additionally, she was banned from returning to the United Kingdom for 5 years and ordered to complete community service focused on cultural education and awareness. As the gavel struck the bench, signaling the end of the hearing, Evelyn exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and devastation washing over her. Relief because she wouldn't be imprisoned, but devastation because her life as she knew it was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, shouting questions and shoving microphones into her face. "Do you regret your actions?" one asked. "What do you have to say to Corporal Harper?" another pressed. Evelyn pushed through the chaos, her head bowed, until her lawyers ushered her into a waiting car. Once inside, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Her carefully curated world had crumbled, leaving behind nothing but rubble. But amidst the wreckage, a small flicker of resolve began to form. Evelyn realized that apologies alone wouldn't fix what she'd broken. If she wanted to rebuild her life, and maybe even earn forgiveness, she would need to prove herself through action. And so, with trembling hands, she picked up her phone and dialed the number her lawyer had given her earlier. It was time to reach out to Corporal Harper directly. The meeting between Evelyn and Corporal James Harper took place in a small, neutral conference room at a local community center. The space was simple: a table, a few chairs, and a window overlooking a quiet garden. But it felt heavy with unspoken tension. Evelyn arrived first, her hands clasped tightly together as she rehearsed what she wanted to say. She had spent days practicing this apology, knowing that words alone wouldn't be enough. When Corporal Harper walked in, accompanied by his commanding officer, Evelyn stood up immediately, her heart pounding. He looked different without his ceremonial uniform. Dressed in plain clothes, he seemed more approachable but no less imposing. His expression was calm, yet there was an undeniable hardness in his eyes that had seen too much and now bore the weight of her reckless actions. Evelyn's throat tightened as she forced herself to speak. "Corporal Harper," she began, her voice trembling, "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for what I did. There's no excuse for my behavior, and I know nothing I say can undo the harm I caused." For a moment, Harper didn't respond. He simply stared at her, studying her face as if trying to determine whether her remorse was genuine. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Thank you for apologizing," he said, his tone measured and steady. "But I need you to understand something. What you did wasn't just about me. It was about everything I stand for. My uniform represents centuries of tradition, sacrifice, and service. By defacing it, you disrespected not only me, but also every person who has ever worn it." Evelyn nodded furiously, tears streaming down her face. "I know that now," she whispered, her voice breaking. "At the time, I thought it was just a joke, something funny for social media. But I see now how wrong I was. I didn't understand the significance of what I was doing, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I've lost so much because of this. My reputation, my money, even my friends. But none of that compares to what I took from you. Your dignity, your pride. I don't know if I can ever make that right." Harper leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze softening just a fraction. "You're here," he said after a long pause. "That's a start. A lot of people would have ignored the backlash or tried to justify their actions. But you came forward, admitted your mistake, and offered to help. That shows some level of accountability." He let those words hang in the air for a moment before adding, "However, forgiveness isn't something I can give easily. This isn't just about me. It's about my family, my colleagues, and everyone else affected by your decision." Evelyn nodded again, understanding completely. "I don't expect forgiveness," she replied honestly. "All I want is the chance to prove that I'm truly sorry. If there's anything else I can do, anything at all, I'll do it. Whether it's speaking to schools about respecting cultural traditions or volunteering with military families, I'll dedicate myself to making amends." Harper exchanged a glance with his commanding officer, who gave a slight nod of approval. Turning back to Evelyn, Harper spoke again. "We appreciate your willingness to take responsibility. And while I can't promise forgiveness right now, I will say this: actions speak louder than words. Show us, over time, that you mean what you're saying. That's the only way to earn trust back." As the meeting drew to a close, Evelyn felt a mix of emotions: relief that Harper hadn't outright rejected her apology, gratitude for his honesty, and determination to follow through on her promises. For the first time since the incident, she felt like she had a path forward. A difficult one, yes, but one where she could begin to rebuild not just her own life, but also the lives she had damaged. As she shook Harper's hand, she silently vowed to never let her impulsiveness ruin another person's world again. Weeks turned into months, and Evelyn threw herself into her promise of making amends. At first, it was overwhelming. Every task felt like climbing a mountain she wasn't sure she could summit. But with each step forward, she began to find a strange sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. Her days were no longer filled with luxury vacations or lavish parties. Instead, they revolved around volunteering, learning, and proving that her apology wasn't just empty words. She started by working closely with organizations that supported military families. Every Saturday morning, she showed up at community centers to help organize events for veterans and their loved ones. She served meals, played games with children, and listened intently as people shared stories about the sacrifices made by those in uniform. At first, many were hesitant to trust her. Some glared at her when she introduced herself, while others simply ignored her presence altogether. But Evelyn didn't let the cold reception deter her. She kept showing up, week after week, until slowly, people began to see her sincerity. One day, a young boy named Tommy tugged on her sleeve during a charity event. "Are you the lady who poured paint on the guard?" he asked innocently. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Evelyn. For a moment, she froze, unsure how to respond. Then, taking a deep breath, she knelt down so she was eye level with the child. "Yes, I am," she admitted softly. "And I'm very sorry for what I did. It was wrong, and I've been trying to make things better ever since." To her surprise, Tommy smiled. "Well, you're helping now, right? That's good." His simple acceptance brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. It was a small moment, but it reminded her why she was doing this, to show that change is possible, even after the worst mistakes. Meanwhile, Corporal Harper continued to monitor her progress from afar. Though he hadn't forgiven her completely, he acknowledged her efforts. Word spread among his colleagues about how seriously she was taking her commitment. One evening, during a formal dinner honoring members of the armed forces, Harper approached Evelyn unexpectedly. "I've heard good things about your work," he said, his tone softer than it had been during their initial meeting. "You're keeping your word." Evelyn blinked back tears, surprised by his acknowledgement. "Thank you," she replied earnestly. "It means a lot coming from you." Harper nodded briefly before walking away, leaving Evelyn feeling both humbled and hopeful. While his words weren't an outright absolution, they signaled something important. He was watching, and he saw her trying. Her journey wasn't without challenges, though. There were moments when the weight of public scrutiny became almost unbearable. Social media remained a battleground, with some users continuing to criticize her relentlessly. Comments like, "She doesn't deserve forgiveness," or "This is too little, too late," stung deeply. But Evelyn refused to let negativity derail her. Instead, she used these criticisms as fuel to push harder, to prove that she wasn't the same reckless person who had once sought attention for all the wrong reasons. Over time, Evelyn also began speaking publicly about her experience. She visited schools and youth programs, sharing her story not to glorify herself, but to warn others about the dangers of impulsivity and entitlement. "I thought my actions were harmless," she would say, standing in front of classrooms full of wide-eyed students. "But they hurt real people and damaged something much bigger than me. Don't make the same mistake I did." As she spoke, Evelyn noticed a shift, not just in others, but within herself. The guilt still lingered, but it no longer consumed her. Instead, it motivated her to keep moving forward, one small act of kindness at a time. She realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future where she could genuinely contribute to the world. And though she knew she might never fully repair the damage she'd caused, she took solace in knowing she was becoming someone worthy of a second chance. A year had passed since the day Evelyn poured paint on Corporal Harper, but it felt like a lifetime ago. The woman who once craved attention for superficial thrills was gone, replaced by someone who valued humility and purpose. Her social media accounts, once filled with flashy photos and outrageous stunts, now featured heartfelt posts about volunteering, cultural education, and the importance of respecting traditions. Followers who had once mocked her began to see a different side of her, a side that was genuine, reflective, and determined to make a positive impact. Evelyn's transformation wasn't just online. It carried over into her everyday life. She moved out of her luxury penthouse and rented a modest apartment closer to the community centers where she volunteered. Her mornings began with coffee brewed in a simple pot rather than room service, and her days were spent surrounded by people whose lives she aimed to improve. She organized workshops to teach young students about cultural sensitivity, emphasizing the value of understanding and appreciating differences. Her own ignorance had cost her dearly, and she wanted to ensure no one else made the same mistake. One crisp autumn afternoon, Evelyn received an invitation that took her breath away. It was from Buckingham Palace, an acknowledgement of her efforts over the past year. The letter invited her to attend a private ceremony honoring individuals who had contributed significantly to supporting military families and veterans. Evelyn read the words over and over, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't forgiveness, it was recognition. And though she didn't expect anything more from Corporal Harper or the institution he represented, this gesture meant the world to her. At the ceremony, Evelyn stood quietly at the back of the room, feeling both proud and unworthy of being there. When her name was called, she walked up to receive a small token of appreciation, a plaque engraved with the words, "For dedication and service." As she shook hands with officials, she spotted Corporal Harper across the room. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her the slightest nod, a silent acknowledgement of how far she'd come. That moment alone felt like redemption. In the months that followed, Evelyn continued her work with renewed energy. She partnered with organizations to create educational programs focused on cultural awareness, ensuring that future generations would grow up with respect for history and tradition. Her story became a lesson in accountability, not just for those who followed her online, but for anyone who doubted whether people could truly change. Though Evelyn knew she could never erase the pain she caused, she found peace in knowing she had done everything possible to make amends. Her journey taught her that mistakes don't define us. It's what we do afterward that matters. As she looked back on the chaos of that fateful day in London, she realized it had been a turning point, not just in her life, but in her understanding of humanity. And so, Evelyn Carter, once infamous for her reckless act, became known instead for her resilience and determination to turn failure into growth. Her legacy wouldn't be the viral video of her pouring paint on a royal guard, but the countless lives she touched while striving to prove that even the biggest mistakes can lead to meaningful change.